Thank you very much, Chair. I want to focus on inflation, if that's all right, and I'll start with you, Richard. Lots changed since October. You had growth, GDP growth at, I think, 6%. You didn't see household incomes falling. In fact, in your forecast, you didn't mention the words cost of living in October. And since then, we've had £10 billion of tax cuts announced. We've had £9 billion of rebates announced. These are not measures that would necessarily negatively impact growth or cost of living. So would you say that inflation is possibly the primary concern and issue that we have in the economy today?
I think it's certainly the biggest shock that we're now having to cope with. I mean, in last year and the year before, I would have said that the pandemic is the biggest shock that we're having to cope with, which was a shock to output. It would have been a shock to employment had the furlough scheme not helped keep people attached to the labour force. I mean, we are now facing a different kind of shock. To some extent, it was a product of the pandemic in that even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there were these big supply-demand mismatches between a recovering economy in Europe and North America, putting pressure on the supply of goods coming out of Asia. So you were already seeing goods price inflation going up, and that was also feeding energy rise in energy costs to manufacture those goods. And then that demand squeeze on the price of energy was then compounded by the Russian invasion, which has put a supply shock into energy markets. And so there was both rising inflation coming out of the pandemic because of that demand-supply mismatch, and now also a supply shock, which I think is the thing which has driven the big downgrade in growth for us. It's driven the big squeeze, 2/3 of the big squeeze on living standards that you're seeing on households. And so, yes, I think it is the big challenge of the coming 12 months, if not beyond.
Thank you. I hear what you're saying, but it is a massive change, going from 5.4% to 8.7% inflation forecast. You've touched on Ukraine and the situation there. Is that differential entirely down to Ukraine and the situation that we're seeing with the Russian invasion?
It's not. It is also, we did our last forecast in October, which meant that we closed it to market data a bit before then. And at that point, these global supply bottlenecks and pressures on goods markets were only really starting to emerge. Forecasters who, like the Bank of England, went after us, ended up having slightly higher forecasts for inflation. But nobody was forecasting that I can remember back then inflation getting up to 9%, which only really happened once the Russian invasion of Ukraine had become clear. But as I said, we saw inflation. We've seen inflation outturn of 6% already, right? And that is above what we were forecasting in October. So we've been consistently surprised on the upside by the strength of inflation.
How much can a chancellor control inflation? How much of this inflationary pressure that we're having in our economy, the shock that you're describing, how much can the Chancellor do about that?
Most of it is imported from the rest of the world of this particular shock. And we've got a chart in the EFO which breaks down what's driving the composition of inflation over time. And much of it is being driven by rises in petrol prices, then rises in energy prices being driven by the rise in oil and gas prices. Now, I should say there are choices to be made about energy regulation, right? Other countries are taking steps to stop the pass-through of higher wholesale energy costs into the retail sector. Now, that needs to be compensated for. The government has to step in to actually cover the operating losses of businesses, but you do have choices around the regulatory regime for household energy costs. But in the long run, economy-wide, you're facing a higher cost of energy if you're a net energy importer like the UK. You can have some influence over domestic inflation expectations and what kind of response you get from wages. That's the kind of thing which monetary policy setters can take into account. It can also be affected by decisions made by government. Over the long term, you've got decisions about how much energy where you get your energy from. Countries like us, which rely on gas and oil for 3/4 of their energy supply, we are very exposed to global energy shocks. Countries that rely more on nuclear, more on renewable, don't have to worry about those as much, but they've made decades of investment in building up that capacity. And if we wanted to change our energy mix, it would take that period of time to shift things. For the near term, we're sort of stuck with the way we produce energy. We can make some changes about the way in which its costs get fed through to households if you wanted to, but much of this is determined by international energy markets.
Okay, thank you. Professor Miles, do you have anything to add to that?
On the question of what can the government do, well, I think the government obviously has done something about offsetting the impact of higher energy prices, the £150, the £200 of...
I'm talking specifically about tackling inflation.
Yeah, I know.
Not the effects.
I was coming to that. The way it's going to be treated, as I understand it in the statistics in the UK, that will not reduce the rate of inflation, and it'll count as more income that people have rather than lower prices they pay. Of course, in a sense, it doesn't matter. If you're a household, what matters is how am I able to pay this bill? Yep. So had the statistical authorities treated it in a different way, and they might do in other countries, the inflation rate wouldn't look quite as grisly as it does look. But in a sense, that doesn't make any difference to households. But I mean, on the bigger question, what can you do about a big shock that reflects events overseas on commodities that we pretty much have to have? Somebody's going to have to take it somewhere. I mean, it's a hit to the standard of living of this country. It's a terms of trade shock, and it's very difficult to avoid the impact of that.
Got it. You mentioned dilemma, I guess, if you're the Chancellor, in terms of intervention and the risk of those interventions being inflationary. And I think in your March update, you've said that the Chancellor's spring statement will add just 0.1% to inflation with the measures that he's announced. Have you looked at the other proposed interventions that are doing the rounds in the public policy arena, and can you say which would be the most inflationary of those?
Well, I think the honest answer is we've been working pretty hard on trying to understand, how the economic situation has changed given the measures that are going to be introduced. So we haven't devoted too much time to sort of alternative policies. So I'm not
For example,
probably in a good
if we
position.
were to cut VAT, would that be inflationary? Would that cause even more problems with inflation?
Well, a cut in VAT would reduce during the period when you cut it, particularly in the year in which a cut came into effect, would have a material impact on the inflation rate, because it's expensive. And the question is, well, what else would you change if you were to cut the VAT rate? One answer is, well, let's not change anything and just borrow some more money. And as you will know, the problem there is we start from a position. It's the old joke. You wouldn't want to start from here. I mean, with the stock of debt, 95% of GDP. 2 years ago, the OBR was forecasting just before COVID hit, really, that today the stock of government debt relative to GDP was 75% of GDP. So it's 20% of GDP higher than what was already a very high number relative to where we thought we'd be years before that. So I don't doubt that if you cut the VAT rate significantly, it would bring the measured inflation rate down quite a lot. The question is, well, so what else is going to change?
Richard, in your forecast this month, it doesn't include broader commodity prices, and we've seen massive volatility in nickel, palladium, wheat. Does that mean that this forecast for inflation could be vastly optimistic?
There is a huge amount of uncertainty about the inflation outlook for all the reasons which you've heard from us already. Just from the energy price component, these prices have been all over the place. We had to take a read at some point. It's turned out gas prices a bit lower, oil prices a bit higher. We think for the moment it's still a reasonable outlook for the energy market. You're right that we didn't look into the inflationary impact of other commodities, of which Russia is a major exporter, nickel, wheat. But what we did do is we augmented the energy price hit to inflation by 25% to take account of just the sort of wider effects that having higher energy prices could have on the cost of other goods and services in the economy, because obviously you don't just get the direct hit from energy prices to inflation. Anything that uses energy as an input also becomes more expensive to produce. So just keeping the lights on in this place, in a restaurant, in a factory, also becomes more expensive. In that, we've also, in essence, wrapped up the kind of wider commodity price effect. Just because we're macroeconomists, we're not microeconomists. If you told me what would happen to the UK economy if you took nickel out of it, the short answer is I have no idea. But in order to capture those kind of wider spillovers, we have augmented that effect by 25%. if that turns out to be wrong, and there's some crucial bit of the British economy that does depend on nickel to function.
There are.
No,
Palladium is a massive part of car production. Wheat
in batteries,
is
yes.
in our food supplies. So it's just surprising that you didn't include or didn't try to predict that within your estimates, because it is potentially a massive impact to our inflation.
Well, as I said, we've augmented the overall impact by about 25%. That's what we've extrapolated from previous energy shocks to the UK economy in terms of their spillover effects, where you also saw rises in other commodity prices that we're a net importer of in production. I don't think there would be a lot of value for us to be trying to chase down every single supply chain all the way back to Russia for every single company in the country to try and figure out what effect it would have.
It's clearly uncertain, right?
It's
a very uncertain situation, and therefore, wouldn't you agree it's actually right to be cautious, particularly on things like the headroom?
Certainly, and not just for that reason, but because you've got a lot of uncertainty about just the energy price outlook. I mean, we do know how much oil and gas we use to produce what we do today, and also to heat homes in the country. And so, just the uncertainty around the energy outlook calls for caution about what you would do in response.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Jeff.
Thanks, Gareth.